Okay, chapter number 4, support and resistance. And these two terms are probably terms that you have heard before. I don't want to overcomplicate it. It's quite simple. Support and resistance is nothing more than a bottom and a ceiling. Okay, so allow me to explain it by showcasing it in a phase where price action is ranging. Okay, so it's going from point A to point B and back and forth. So this is point A and this is point B. So hypothetically speaking, let's say price would start at point A, eventually goes to point B, goes back to point A, and so forth, of course. Then hopefully you do understand, or you do start to recognize as well, that there are certain points where price tends to revert. Okay, so either you go from an uptrend to a downtrend, or you go from a downtrend to an uptrend, but there are price points within the area, okay, where we tend to reject or where we tend to find some form of support. And these 2 points, so to say, the bottom part and the top part, this can be seen as so-called support, and the beautiful, or resistance, of course, depending on the context and depending on where price actually is. So the beautiful part about this is when you start to recognize these points, when you start to recognize where price can potentially reject from, or where you can hold like support, then you can obviously also translate this to potential trading setups, and that's what we want to see. However, you do need to understand at a certain point, it's inevitable price needs or will break out. Okay, price never needs to do anything, but I think it's quite understandable that price never ever infinitely always keeps on ping-ponging between 2 levels. Eventually, that's inevitable. You will always either, in this case, let's say, let's start with the bearish case where price tends to weaken and drop off, which is negative, of course, for the price, where it weakens and eventually tends to break levels and go down. Or in the bullish case, of course, where eventually price flourishes, you break specific levels, or you break the initial ceiling, the initial resistance, and you tend to go up. So this is, of course, also something that we need to take into account. However, initially something that was functioning as support. Okay, so allow me to just showcase this with these circles. Something that was initially support, whenever you break through it and you come back to test the same zone, so to say, eventually the support becomes resistance, which leads the price to eventually go down lower. Okay. However, this is also vice versa. So where price rejected previous 3 times in this example, of course, eventually when you break out of it, this so-called ceiling or resistance eventually becomes support, which allows price to keep on, pushing up higher, which is obviously something that is very nice whenever you're investing or whenever you're trading, with the expectation that price wants to go higher. So allow me to elaborate a little bit better on these 2 last parts, because again, you do need to understand, of course, I just gave you an example where price tends to reject or finds some form of support in a sideways range. However, we also have 2 other key trends, main trends, which is the uptrend and the downtrend, of course. So let's say price eventually hits a specific ceiling, okay? And that's not up to us to decide. That's up to the market makers, the big boys, the institutionals with the biggest capital, the liquidity, so to say. They usually decide what's going to happen with the price, of course. So let's just say, hypothetically speaking, this would be a ceiling. This would be a resistance level where eventually price just rejects from and price goes all the way to a bit lower. However, at some point, we happen to find some support and we break out of it. So this initial ceiling or resistance zone or level is eventually going to be flipped in support. And that's how you keep on uptrending, okay? This is pretty much how you keep a specific uptrend intact, okay? By creating levels, rejecting from these levels, okay? So this is initial resistance, but eventually breaking out of these resistance levels and flipping them to the so-called support levels, okay? These are the main characteristics of a so-called uptrend. The key characteristics, so to say, is just very simple to understand. So first of all, price. Obviously, when you look at the core of it, or if you look at the uptrend on a high level, price tends to go from lower to higher prices. However, when it comes to the market structure, and this is also a chapter where I will explain the market structure a bit better, which is on a very high level, you need to understand to a certain extent, you keep on creating so-called higher highs and higher lows, okay? So this is one of the key characteristics, main characteristics of a so-called uptrend, okay? So you keep on pretty much staircasing from lower to higher. And that's something you need to understand, okay? So this is pretty much what's happening when we have support and resistance in the form of an uptrend. However, you also need to understand, of course, allow me to remove this one quickly. This is also vice versa. So when you have an uptrend where price tends to go from lower to higher, sometimes during specific market phases or market conditions, market circumstances, news events that just didn't turn out properly, things were said by Trump or whatever, eventually price goes from higher to lower. And in this case, where price was eventually holding a form of support or a bottom somewhere, somehow, which eventually led price to, you know, give some form of bump, give some form of price increase, so to say. Then I'm pretty much referring to these green rectangles. Unfortunately, price just couldn't maintain this pump. It couldn't maintain the increase, and it just weakened and it lost specific levels or zones. So this is something that we would have initially called support, of course. I would just call it an S, indication for S. And then eventually you will lose this particular level, and eventually the support becomes resistance. And that's the characteristic of a downtrend. Price goes from higher to lower, and unfortunately the main characteristic is you're losing support and you're flipping it to the so-called resistance. And then when it comes to the market structure, again, I will explain this a bit later, but this is what is called a lower low, and this is called a lower high. So whenever you understand this market structure as well, and you recognize these key points within a chart, of course, you can definitely anticipate or take some beautiful trades. So this, in the essence, is support and resistance. Now we are going to apply the theory into practicality to give you a better understanding and also a feeling for the concept, of course. And I'm going to showcase you a couple of beautiful examples where support and resistance is well displayed. However, in order to identify and recognize these concepts, the support and resistance, where support becomes resistance and vice versa, you need to understand price interaction, okay? And price interaction, simply explained, is nothing more than a place where price tends to stop declining or stops rising, okay? So whenever you understand this and you look at a graph and you can identify a place with a lot of price interaction, that's where the support and resistance comes into play. And I can already show you, I already see a lot of beautiful support resistance flips, but that's also something, you know, that comes with time. The more you practice, the more you spend time on the charts, the easier it becomes. So let's just kickstart with the very first one. Let's go from the left to the right. Let's just explain the price action and the support resistance concept in chronological order. So if we go to the left, what do we see? So let's just assume this horizontal, this light gray box, this is a support zone. As you can see as well, where I draw my arrows, to a certain extent, every single time when price tends to go to this box, it stops declining and it actually reverses. Because after, you know, dumping, going lower, 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 eventually you see price going higher. Okay, so this is most definitely a place where a lot of price interaction has taken place, and this is of course a perfect example of support. So this is like a floor for the price. When the price gets here, price tends to stop going down and reverses, okay? People usually buy here, which causes price to go up. So this is pretty much what we see. So this is support and this is support as well. However, so this is also a characteristic of an uptrend, of course, because again, when we zoom out and we make use of the higher time frames, in this case, each candlestick represents 1 week, we clearly see that we were in a very healthy uptrend. However, as you can see on the right part, unfortunately, we break through it and the support becomes resistance. You see, there we go. This is resistance. So price broke through the support zone, and eventually price also changes trend, and something that was initially support became resistance, leading to lower prices. Okay, so this is resistance. This is like a ceiling for the price. When the price gets here, price often stops rising. So this is a perfect example of a very first support becoming resistance flip. Okay, so then if we zoom in a little bit, we can actually, let me keep this text to make it a little bit easier for you as well. Here as well, beautiful example, and this is more local. So we were zooming out and really taking into account many or a lot of price action. However, if we put, for example, a horizontal line over here, a box, then again, what do we see? This was initially resistance. Okay, so where I draw my lines, you can clearly see that whenever price happens to get here, price often stops rising and it went lower. Okay, so for example, price got to this point, it went lower. Price got to this point, it went lower. However, when you break through it, you get this so-called resistance becomes support flip. And then, as you can see here, every single time when price touches the exact same box, it goes up. So that's also something that is very important to identify, and hopefully you can already understand, especially with all these puzzle pieces that I'm giving you per chapter or per module, that you're most definitely seeing a story being created in real time. So whenever you can translate this to the best of your ability, that's where magic happens. So this is a perfect example where resistance becomes support. And I can most definitely give you a couple of beautiful other examples. Again, this is also something, as you can see, maybe I should just put a box up here. And this is also something that is a beautiful example. Boom. So maybe I should zoom in a little bit better on the daily chart. So we went from the weekly to the daily chart. And then, for example, over here, if I put two simple horizontal lines, this is probably one of the best examples that I can really give you out of all the examples. Everything that we see here, every single time when price tends to go to the upper side of the box, as in the ceiling, then you can clearly see that every single time price tends to weaken and it tends to stop rising. Okay, it hits the box, goes lower. It hits the box, it goes lower. It hits the box, it goes lower. But this is also, of course, the case for the support. Whenever we have this bottom box or this floor, it hits the box, it goes up, and it goes up. And eventually you stop ping-ponging, because let's say these are the two key major levels or zones. The one at the bottom obviously is support, and the one at the top is resistance. But eventually, as you can see, this is not like infinite. At some point, price just breaks through. Whether it goes up or down, that's up to the market to decide, of course. That's not in our control. But in this case, price, as you can see here, let me just get rid of this real quick. In this case, price broke through the resistance, and then you just eventually keep on pumping to higher levels and higher prices. So this is a perfect example where, yeah, resistance and support is beautifully well displayed. And then one last, this is actually a beautiful one as well. This is also a perfect example of support and resistance. So as you can see here, price, it's crazy. When you start to recognize this, it's kind of crazy. So for some reason, and that's not something that we could ever know, of course, but so for some reason, this was initially serving as a form of resistance, okay? After breaking through, of course, the previous range, so to say, we were pumping to higher prices. But then again, you saw that price eventually slow down a little bit. However, this so-called resistance level that was initially created, we broke through it, and this resistance eventually becomes support. As this box, this 91,000, as you can see over here, this 91K, 92K, as this box now becomes support because we broke through the resistance, see what happens. Every single time when you hit this zone, price tends to go up, 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 up. And this also determines your bullish bias, whether you're still looking to the upside, or your bearish bias, where you're looking to the downside, okay? So beautiful again, one of the last moments where we still had some form of upside momentum, and then eventually price weakens, okay? Unfortunately, at some point it's inevitable, price tends to break through the support zone, and then what happens, even though it's not like the most perfect example, literally at the moment where price breaks through it, this support eventually is flipped into resistance, back into resistance, and that allows, or that leads to price going to lower prices. So hopefully by showcasing you a couple of examples, this really makes you realize that it's very important to understand these key concepts in order to make well-informed decisions.